I've wanted to rant about this concept for a while, the paradox of tolerance. Now, this is a common rebuttal in my comment section, usually by TERFs, which is, by blocking bigotry, aren't you censoring free speech and therefore showing the same type of bigotry that you're trying to combat? You are excluding me from your space! Yeah, every comment is like minus 1 IQ point. Welcome to another episode of Talking Points. Yes, I brought it back just for you. A series where I take something from the internet that annoys me, usually Twitter, but in this case, my comment sections, and just the general idea online that we're meant to tolerate bigotry, and I have a little bit of a rant about it. Talking points. Again, just the normal disclaimer, these videos are a bit more opinionated, critical, and sometimes harsh in comparison to my more neutral, soft take videos that people accuse of being fence-sitting. You're entitled to your own opinions on these topics, but for heaven's sakes, keep your bigotry to yourselves, people. Come on, I asked one thing. One thing. Why is the left so intolerant of other people's opinions? Asks the man in the comment section, freshly blocked after explaining why trans women aren't real women. Politely. Of course, you see, he wasn't being rude. No! He was simply exercising his freedom of speech. And in return, cancelled, held accountable, criticised. How dare they? Even though, my comment was merely a suggestion, I can't actually block people on YouTube. I can hide them from my channel, but what's the fun in that? But apparently, suggesting that, your opinions don't coincide with my opinions, so maybe don't waste your time in my comment section. Apparently that's censorship. Censorship would be actually taking away your voice on every single platform. YouTube is this great thing where you can make your own videos. I probably should not be encouraging bigots to make their own videos. -1 to me. This kind of moral performance where bigotry is dressed up as just my opinion and social consequences are mistaken for gulag-like persecution. It lands us squarely in the lap of Karl Popper's paradox of tolerance. The one that too much tolerance in a society can destroy a tolerant society. Now, Popper didn't say be mean to anyone who disagrees with you. He said that if we allow the intolerant to spread unchecked, then they will ultimately silence everyone else. And that's not free speech. That's ideological monopolization. But in the culture war circus that is the internet, Popper's warning has been rebranded. Now when someone faces backlash for racist tweets or a TERF manifesto, we're told it's proof that the left eats its own. That the tolerant left has become intolerant. Cancel culture is Stalin with a Twitter account. That feminists are actually misogynists for recognising that trans women are in fact women. This is where liberal ideas of openness get twisted into weapons used to protect intolerance, from being challenged, from being moderated, and heaven forbid for being unpopular. Today I'm going to argue that the paradox of tolerance was never about suppressing ideas. It's about protecting democracy from those around us who use its freedoms to destroy it. In our current media ecosystem, the philosophical line has blurred. Tolerance has become a PR stunt, wielded by reactionaries who believe being disagreed with is oppression. And cancel culture is often little more than a rebrand of social accountability. Something that conservatives seem to find terrifying only if it's aimed in their direction. Let's rewind to 1945. The world had just survived fascism's grand performance, complete with mass surveillance, censorship, and genocide. Karl Popper, fresh from watching liberal democracies flirt with extinction, sits down to write The Open Society and Its Enemies. In it, he drops one of his most misquoted, misunderstood, and memeified warnings of modern philosophy, the paradox of tolerance. Unlimited tolerance must lead to the disappearance of tolerance. What Popper meant is simple, but apparently not simple enough for internet discourse. If a tolerant society allows intolerant ideologies to take root without pushback, those ideologies will grow, spread, and eventually destroy the very freedoms that allowed them to speak in the first place. Well, that wasn't a spicy Twitter take, it was a survival manual for democracy. You don't have to host the Nazis in your living room to prove that you believe in free speech, okay? You don't have to debate TERFs to show that you are open to different opinions, and you definitely do not need to platform far-right extremists in the idea of neutrality. In political liberalism, John Rawls draws the line between reasonable, those who accept pluralism and democratic equality, and the unreasonable, those who reject others' basic rights. In Rawls' vision, then, a healthy democracy isn't just about everyone talking. It's about who gets taken seriously in public reason. And if your worldview is built on, I don't know, the idea that certain people just shouldn't exist, then you're not just saying your opinion. You're not playing by the rules of tolerance at all. There is a difference between saying that an ideology such as TERFism, fascism, conservatism is inherently flawed and shouldn't exist, and saying that a certain group of people that do not make the choice to identify with that group shouldn't exist. Ideology and gender identity, sexuality, ethnicity, you can't critique them in the same way. Then there's Jürgen Habermas, who sounds like he'd make a mean espresso and a 3-hour point about the public sphere. Coincidentally, he wrote a book about the public sphere. He argued that for democratic discourse to function, we need rational, inclusive communication, what he calls communicative action. But when intolerance enters the chat, rational debate collapses. You can't reason with someone who thinks that you're subhuman or unnatural. You can't debate genocide, even though people in this world still are. Popper, Rawls and Habermas all converge on one point. Tolerance isn't the passive acceptance of all ideas. It's a protective mechanism, a boundary that defends open society from ideologies that would gut it from the inside. Yet in online discourse, this has all been lost in translation, or probably never read about at all. There's a familiar script that plays out on social media every time someone is criticised for, say, misgendering a trans person or tweeting something mildly racist as a joke. The offender doesn't apologise. Instead, they accuse the critics of being intolerant. Whatever happened to the freedom of speech, they cry. I thought the left was supposed to be tolerant. Cue thousands of quote tweets, a newsletter rant from a centrist columnist, and even worse, a new YouTube grifter pipeline forming in real time. This is rhetorical aikido, using the opponent's moral commitments against them. It's not new, but it is thriving in our algorithmically juiced attention economy. The idea that the left should be tolerant of all views weaponizes a surface level reading of liberal pluralism. But as we saw with Popper, Rawls and Habermas, liberal tolerance is not a blank check. It assumes that everyone in the discourse is committed to the shared values of a democratic society: equality, dignity, mutual recognition, respect. But once you reject those, you're not part of that conversation. You're threatening the terms of it. But thanks to media framing, this nuance gets flattened. Public figures who are held accountable for discriminatory views, like J.K. Rowling, Graham Linehan, or every cancelled yet millionaire talking head in the Times opinion section, frame themselves as victims of leftist overreach. This is what Wendy Brown called tolerance as governance, a form of control masquerading as virtue. When used as a standard for marginalised people to be grateful or polite, tolerance becomes less about coexistence and more about compliance. Their bigotry is positioned as opinion, as protecting women and girls, whether that be from trans women or immigrants or asylum seekers. They hate being called out for transphobia or racism, but they're proud of their transphobia and their racism. In reality, they don't want their views to be positioned as intolerant ones, because then they would have to admit to being bigoted and they wouldn't be able to rely on the idea of free speech. And even when you lay out exactly why a person is transphobic or racist, they will still argue the same tired talking points. They don't want to have their worldview changed, and it's easier to name the criticizer as misogynist rather than admit to their own hatred. The underlying problem is who gets to define what tolerance looks like? Now, in the UK media, it's often not the people most at risk of harm. Instead, mainstream outlets like the BBC, The Telegraph, The Times amplify narratives of embattled free speech warriors, giving more airtime to the discomfort of the powerful than to structural marginalisation of the powerless. Let's be clear, calling out racism, transphobia or misogyny is not intolerance, it's moral clarity. And what gets labelled cancel culture is often just people with less power demanding that the powerful take responsibility. The right to speak does not entitle you to an audience, a platform, or universal applause, or to spread bigotry and hatred in my comment section. Tolerance does not mean tolerating abuse. It means knowing where to draw the line and why that line matters. So let's be honest, the phrase cancel culture has actually become ideological shorthand for people who were mean to me online after I said something bigoted. Now, don't get me wrong, there has been a time, especially on Twitter, where people were policed left, right and centre, and their arguments were often taken in bad faith or extremised when they didn't really say anything that bad. But when it's coming out of the mouth of someone that's literally funding to take away the rights of a marginalised community, then yeah, it is just people being mean because you're a bigot. But scratch beneath the surface and you'll find something much more mundane and much more democratic. Not mass censorship, not gulags, not a public pitchfork mob, but accountability. Wow, so scary, right? Oh my god, let's run away, let's run away! To understand this, we need to ask a basic but actually radical question. What is cancel culture? According to media sociologist Eve Ng, apologies if I've butchered that pronunciation, it's not one cohesive practice, but a loosely defined set of cultural and social responses to perceived transgressions. That can mean anything from a Twitter ratio to a loss of employment. And while the term implies overreach, most cancellations end in nothing. The cancelled rebound, rebrand or double down, and some even get more popular. You right, Jordan Peterson? In reality, most so-called cancellations are not silencing campaigns. They're attempts to shift cultural norms, to say this isn't okay anymore and expect some change. Sarah Ahmed would call this a feminist killjoy moment, when marginalised people disrupt the flow of civility to name harm. When you speak up against someone in power or someone with power, you're not cancelling them. You're refusing to let politeness enable abuse. But the media doesn't frame it that way, do they? Instead, the dominant narrative paints cancellation as a form of leftist purging, a threat to free expression. Sorry, microphone, I know you feel threatened right now. And proof that liberalism has gone too far. Let's be real. The narrative isn't neutral. It's part of a broader cultural backlash against social justice movements from Black Lives Matter to trans rights, where the problem is not the injustice, but the fact that someone dared to talk about it. The irony, of course, is that many free speech defenders who rail against cancel culture don't actually want open debate. They'll twist facts, they'll misconstrue evidence, but most importantly, they want immunity from criticism, from consequence, from collective moral evolution. They invoke free speech to protect their right to punch down, but cry foul when others punch back. In this way, cancel culture becomes a discursive shield, designed to shield and protect not dialogue but dominance. It reframes legitimate pushback as persecution and attempts to recenter the feelings of the privileged over the harms experienced by the marginalised. Now, the mob isn't coming for your jokes, even if they aren't funny. People are less willing to pretend your jokes don't hurt anyone. That's the thing. And if you're, calling that cancellation, maybe what you're really upset about is not losing your voice, but losing your impunity. There's this moment, in every free speech debate where someone will declare, you should be allowed to say whatever you want, but what they really mean is, I should be allowed to say whatever I want, and you should shut the fuck up about it. The problem is, speech doesn't exist in a vacuum. I make this point all the time on my channel, but these things don't just exist. They're not just said in the comfort of your own home for nobody of relevance to hear. We saw this starkly during the 2024 UK racist riots, when racist and anti-migrant conspirators spread rapidly across social media, particularly on Telegram and X, fueling days of coordinated attacks on refugee centres, protests outside of hotels and street violence on the curb of mosques. Suddenly, the free speech discourse had to reckon with its consequences. In one high-profile case, Lucy Connolly, a far-right activist and prolific online poster, was sentenced to 5 years in prison for inciting racial hatred and violence. Her post directly encouraged people to take matters into their own hands and cleanse the streets, which persecutors linked to subsequent violent attacks. Connolly's case wasn't just a story about hate speech, it was, in a way, a legal milestone. It proved that online rhetoric, in particular when it was inflammatory and targeted enough, could cross the threshold into criminal incitement under the Public Order Act of 1986. Critics of this crackdown, however, were quick to point out contradictions. To make space for dozens of new convictions, including others charged with incitement, the government reportedly released non-violent offenders early. A move that sparked backlash from both civil rights organisations and criminal justice advocates. Some argued that the state was using their carceral powers to perform public condemnation. Others questioned the proportionality. Should a tweet, even one inciting violence, carry a longer sentence than some physical assaults? This tension goes to the heart of the paradox of digital free speech. The state must act to protect people from harm, but how it acts, and against whom, reveals deeper political fault lines. In the UK law, the balance is explicit. Article 10 of the Human Rights Act 1998 protects freedom of expression, but qualifies it where speech threatens the rights of others or public safety. The Communications Act 2003 further criminalises grossly offensive or threatening communications sent via public networks. And under the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, Article 20 in brackets 2, compels states to prohibit any advocacy of national, racial or religious hatred that constitutes incitement to discrimination, hostility, or violence. Too long didn't read. This means free speech is not a get out of jail free card for hate. It's a right weighed against harm. And in the digital age, harm scales fast. The Rabat Plan of Action calls on states to distinguish between offensive expression and real incitement by evaluating content, context, and the likelihood of violence. Connolly's case ticked all three boxes. Critics of those on the crackdown of the political right would also point to the many counter-protesters who incited violence not having equal punishment, or the death to rolling trans activists not being taken seriously by police or the public sphere. Now, I personally do not agree with inciting violence or death threats from or towards any political association, regardless of whether I agree with their political views or not. However, if someone is talking about punching a Nazi, I'm not going to die on that hill criticising them for it. Maybe these things are treated a little bit differently due to the nature of their reach or the likelihood of their incitements being heard and followed through with. It's like that, death to all straight people that came along a few years ago. In reality, gay people are not going to, come up in arms and kill all the straight people. It's just not going to happen, is it? I'd like to hope that people would think of inciting violence against Nazis as very different to inciting violence towards an ethnic group. That's what I'm going to say on the matter. Please don't let there be a shitstorm in my comments. Please don't let there be a shitstorm in my comments. Still, it's telling how selectively this framework can be applied. Marginalised groups, trans people, migrants are disproportionately silenced through platform harassment or state scrutiny, while those invoking free speech as a defence for bigotry often enjoy political and media protection. It's the appearance of free speech as an equal battlefield, when the weapons aren't exactly equally distributed. Media scholar Natalie Fenton calls this the myth of the open public sphere. Online spaces look like free marketplaces of ideas, but they are governed by opaque moderation algorithms, corporative incentives, and increasingly state surveillance. If I write the word cis in a tweet, it will get flagged as hate speech. Who gets heard? Who gets banned? Who gets jailed? None of it is neutral. So when someone claims they've been cancelled for speaking the truth, the better question is, who has the power to define harm and who pays the price for it? Because, as we saw in 2024, words don't just hurt feelings. Sometimes they burn buildings. So let's return to the original whine. Why is the left so intolerant of other people's opinions? In isolation, it seems like a plea for civility, but as this video has hopefully shown, it's more often a rhetorical sleight of hand, a way of reframing pushback as oppression, critique as censorship, and consequence as tyranny. Karl Popper's paradox of tolerance was never an argument for moral authoritarianism. It was a philosophical warning that if we let bigotry and violence parade unchallenged under the banner of free speech, then tolerance itself collapses. But in today's digital ecosystem, that warning has been twisted. Tolerance has become an aesthetic, a brand value, emptied of substance and weaponized to protect the very ideologies it was meant to guard against. Ultimately, the question isn't whether we should tolerate intolerance. That part is pretty clear. We shouldn't. The real question is, who gets to decide what counts as intolerance? And what happens when power shields itself behind the language of liberty? In a world where free speech can be both a shield and a sword, we need less mythology and more accountability. But that's just my opinion. If you did enjoy this video, please leave a like and subscribe if you're new. And with that, I'll see you soon.